Chapter 4. To Grandmother's House I Go. Raymond arrived at the house promptly at 10 a.m. I was very nervous and babbled a bit, asking him a million questions, but just as he was when he picked me up to go to the luncheon, Raymond was not talkative. He actually seemed frightened of questions. I assumed that he was afraid of Grandma Olivia and losing his job, but most of the New Englanders I had met had their lips glued most of the time, especially around people they considered outsiders. Sometimes the way some of them talked about the people who didn't come from here made me think I was walking around a third eye in my forehead. Carrie tried to explain it to me by telling me that people who lived off the sea tended to distrust landlubbers, thinking of them as softer, spoiled, and unappreciative, taking the fish on the plate for granted. How far is the rest home, Raymond? I asked when we started off. Not far. Have you been there? I asked. And he turned and looked at me as if to see if I were asking a serious question. Aye, he replied. To take my grandmother to see Belinda? I asked. Maybe Grandma Olivia had lied to me. No. Do you have a relative there? I persisted. No, he said, but he didn't continue. No wonder they loved clams so much here on the Cape, I thought. The family and all the people associated with them couldn't be within a tighter shell. It had rained earlier, and I thought it was going to be a dark, dreary day. One of those days when the sea breeze was so chilly you wanted to wear a sweater, even in the summer. But just before Raymond arrived, the blanket of charcoal gray clouds developed, and a seam of blue that widened until the clouds began to melt away like snow in the spring sunshine. The warm rays made me squint when I gazed at the scenery, but at least I felt a little better. I had woken this particular morning with a stomach so tight I could barely swallow water. I pondered about the bathroom, sifting through the clothes in my closet, trying to decide what would be appropriate to wear, not only to the rest home, but to meet my real grandmother for the first time ever. I didn't want to get dressed up and look too formal, but I didn't want to look underdressed, as if I didn't place great importance to this visit. Because of the gloomy-looking day I found when I first looked out the window this morning, I chose a light blue cotton cardigan with a matching tank top and silky rayon posy print skirt. The hem rested a little less than an inch above my knee, and it was another one of Laura's outfits. I had tried on but not worn. I brushed out my hair and put on some lipstick, even though Uncle Jacob had told me on more than one occasion that young women shouldn't be wearing lipstick during the day. I didn't know from what well of information he drew these rules, but I began to feel more pity for my dead cousin Laura, imagining that what she had gone through, although Uncle Jacob never missed an opportunity to tell me how obedient and respectful she was. Intimidated and terrified. More like it, I thought. He gave me a disapproving look when I went down to breakfast. How do you eat with lipstick painted on your mouth? He asked. It's not a problem, I said softly. Aunt Sarah looked away and busied herself with something to avoid the discussion. Disgusting habits some young women have these days, Uncle Jacob muttered. I felt the blood rush into my face. Men are more disgusting when they puff on pipes, cigars, and cigarettes, filling their mouths with nicotine and tar, and turning their teeth yellow and giving themselves breath like a dragon, I countered. Carrie laughed. Uncle Jacob turned purple with anger, but swallowed his words and went back to his food instead. Naturally, May was full of questions about why I dressed up and where I was going. I did my best to explain, but she couldn't understand why I kept referring to Belinda as Grandma Belinda. Carrie promised her he would spend time with her this morning and help her understand. I expected to be back before lunch, and Carrie had proposed that he, May, and I go to town. I agreed, even though it was hard to think past my meeting with my grandmother. I hoped it would go well, and I would return feeling I had someone I could really call family. But the trepidation that seeped into my body all night was now making my legs tremble and my heart keep thumping harder and faster than normal all the way to the rest home. We rode for nearly a half an hour before Raymond turned up the side road of the wooden country. It was heavy with pine, wild apple, and scrub oak. At the clearing on our right, I saw a flock of song sparrows circle, then roar to the right to the tops of the trees where they perched. In another 10 minutes before the rest home came to view. Whoever had planned this location obviously wanted it away from the more populated areas. I wondered if the owners were thinking how much people like to keep their elderly out of sight, out of mind. As we drove in silence, I couldn't help from wondering who came to visit Grandma Belinda if Grandma Olivia didn't. There was no one else in her family that I knew. What it was like to be housed, institutionalized in a world without friends, relatives, dependent entirely on the kindness of strangers. Did she feel helpless, forgotten, and discarded? Did this keep her from trying to get well? Knowing this family, I thought she might be better off where she is. The rest home wasn't in an unpleasant setting. The ocean was behind it with the sun glimmering on its silvery gray surface. The front of the building faced a long rolling lawn with benches, a rock garden, and some fountains. It looked peaceful, clean, and well maintained. It was obviously a rest home for the wealthier, sick, and elderly. The building itself had 3 stories. It had a front porch the width of the building and a short set of cement steps. The wooden wall cladding was done in Wedgwood blue, and the shutters on the windows were bone white. As we pulled up to the drive, I saw there were 2 elderly gentlemen sitting on the porch, rocking and gazing with some interest. The driveway pitched to the right, and the parking area was just adjacent to the building. I could see that behind a large house was an elaborate garden, more benches and seating areas, and a gazebo twice the size of Grandma Olivia's. There were some fall red maple trees, more scrub oaks and pine, and the pathways were lined with trim bushes. As he shut off the engine, Raymond stepped out and came around to open my door. I got out slowly. The front entrance is right there, he nodded. I'll wait in the car. The whole time? I don't mind, he said, and returned to his seat, pulled his cap down over his eyes, and settled for a nap. I walked over to the flagstone walkway and started up the stairs. Hello, I said. You bring the paper, he asked. Pardon? Today's paper. You bring the paper? No, I'm sorry. I'm here visiting Belinda Gordon. Where's the paper? The elderly man asked. The man, holding his hand behind his right ear. She ain't got it, he said. What? She ain't got it, he shouted. What's today, a holiday? The second man asked. I smiled at them nervously and entered the home. The lobby was bright, homey, with light blue curtains and a blonde oak floor. The walls had large paintings depicting rustic country scenes, ocean scenes in rainbow colors, some with fishermen, some simply with sailboats, painted against the twilight sky. The cushioned chairs and settees were all done in light blue floral patterns. A little more than a dozen residents were seated in the lobby, a few reading magazines, some talking to playing checkers, and some were just sitting staring at nothing. Those who seemed aware of what was happening around them gazed up at me with anticipation as I entered. Almost all looked as they hoped I were there to visit them. I could practically feel the loneliness. A woman came and said, "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm Melanie Logan, here to see Belinda Gordon." "Oh yes, Mrs. Logan called to say you would be coming. I'm Mrs. Green. Miss Gordon is in the recreation." "You haven't brought her any candy, have you?" "We try to limit the sugar intake. Many of our residents are diabetic, but they don't watch themselves, and they offer each other candy." "No, ma'am," I said. "I've brought nothing but myself." "Fine," she said, nodding. "Right this way." I looked back at the people in the lounging area. Everyone looked frozen. One man playing checkers folded his hand in mid-air with a checker between his finger. "This way," Miss Green said, pausing at the doorway of the corridor. I hurried to catch up. "How is Mrs. Gordon?" I asked. "Actually, she's doing very well. Being on a healthy diet with proper exercise has given her a new lease on life and added years. She happens to be one of the residents of whom I'm very proud. Are you a friend of the family?" "I happen to be her granddaughter," I said, as matter-of-factly as I could. She stopped walking. "Granddaughter?" Her smile was stretching out on her thin lips to the point where it looked like rubber bands about to snap. "But my understanding is Belinda Gordon had no children." I shrugged. "That's who I am," I said. She squeezed her eyebrows and shook her head, clicking her tongue as she continued through the double doors. "I would have thought Mrs. Logan would have mentioned that," she muttered. "She must have just forgotten," I said. She looked at me sideways as she opened the double doors to the room filled with game tables, a television set, and imitation leather settees and easy chairs. I paused as a realization hit me. I didn't know what my grandmother looked like. The only pictures I'd seen of Grandma Olivia's basement were pictures of her when she was much, much younger. Mrs. Green turned toward me and waited. "I'm afraid I've never met her," I said. "You've never met her?" "Well," she said. "Well." She shook her head and nodded toward the tiny woman sitting by the window reading what looked like a child's picture book. She wore a white knit shawl over a pale green dress. Even from across the room, I could see the resemblance between her and Grandma Olivia. They were both small-featured. However, as I drew closer, I thought Grandma Belinda's features were more dainty, more doll-like. Her eyes were bluer and brighter, and something she read brought a smile to her face. Her smile was warmer, happier. With Mrs. Green not far behind, I started across the room. Only Belinda didn't break her concentration. She turned the pages of the picture book and widened her smile. "Hello," I said. She looked up slowly, and I could see she had very young-looking crystal blue eyes that highlighted her gentle, soft smile. Her skin didn't look as translucent as Grandma Olivia's. In fact, Grandma Belinda appeared healthier and more robust, with a richer complexion, despite being locked away in a rest home. "Where have you been?" she asked quickly. "Where have I been?" I looked at Mrs. Green. "This is a visitor, Belinda. She doesn't work here, and she's not a volunteer." She squinted at me. "Oh," she said with great disappointment. "I thought you came here to read to me." "I could do that," I replied and sat in the chair just across from her. Mrs. Green turned to speak to another resident, but she didn't move too far away from us. "My name's Melanie." I told Grandma Belinda and waited to see if there was any note of recognition. She simply widened her smile a bit. That's a nice name. She paused and tilted her head. I think I once knew someone named Melanie. Had she heard of me? My mother's name was Hallie, I said. I glanced again at Mrs. Green, who was obviously leaning in closer to hear our conversation. Oh, Grandma Belinda's lips remained in the shape of an O, as if she just realized something significant. You know who I am? I pursued. She shook her head, more like someone who wanted to deny what she knew than someone who was saying she didn't know. Haley lived with your sister Olivia, I said, and her husband Samuel. I haven't seen my sister today, she said. She turned and looked toward the door. She's probably in her room, sulking as usual, just because Nelson asked me to go on a walk with him and didn't ask her. She gave me a slight laugh that sounded like a tinkle of wind chimes. Her eyes brightened mischievously. I showed her the bracelet he bought me, and she just sucked in her cheeks and turned her face into a big old sourpuss. She said I asked him to buy it for me. Can you imagine? I wouldn't ask a man to buy me anything, especially Nelson Childs. I've never had to ask. She leaned forward to whisper. But she does, she said and laughed again. She asked Paul Enfield to take her to the Fleet dance Saturday night because no one asked her. But he said he wasn't going. I knew he was going. She assured me with a knowing nod. So, she leaned back. She had to go with Samuel Logan. Rather, he had to go with her. He didn't want to go. He wanted to ask me, but someone else had already. I don't ask men for things, she emphasized with another small nod. I don't have to. She paused to drink me in and then nodded. I bet you don't have to ask him either. I laughed. Mrs. Green left the side of the other residence and moved directly behind us. What are you going to read to me? Are you going to read Sleeping Beauty? I like Sleeping Beauty. Grandma Belinda said emphatically. If you like, I said. Where is it? Don't you have it? Didn't you bring it? She asked, a little more frantically. No, I'm sorry. She pouted. I gazed at the pile of children's books on the small table between us and chose one. Would you like me to read this? She glanced at the cover and then nodded slightly. I looked about the room. The other residents were back doing other things for the most part. I noticed Miss Green had moved around the room in front of us, to the side and then behind us again, circling, spending more time with others, but always keeping within earshot. It didn't take me long to read the child's story, and when I finished, Grandma Belinda clapped. Isn't that a nice story, she said. I love stories with happy endings. Olivia said there's no happy endings, only endings. Has she been to see you? She's too busy to see me. She's high in society now. She has rich people to entertain. Her nose is up here. She started tilting her head back, like someone who had a nosebleed, and pointing up her forehead. I'm an embarrassment to her. That's what she says. She sounds like the big bad wolf when she says it. Grandma Belinda said, lowering her voice to make it gruff. You're an embarrassment. Stay in your room. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she smiled impishly again. But even if I'm in my room, they come to see me. They knock on the window, and sometimes I open the window and let them in. Who? Wouldn't you like to know? She sang and laughed. I had to laugh too. She was obviously confusing time, mixing the events that occurred years and years ago with events that occurred more recently. Don't you know anything about me? I asked, hopefully. I'm Haley's daughter, Melanie. You know who Haley is, don't you? She stopped smiling. Can't talk about her, or she'll have them heave me on the street, she muttered. Is that what Olivia said? I asked. Can't talk about her, she said, and she pretended she was zipping her lips shut. You can talk to me, I said. I'm Haley's daughter. I'm your granddaughter. She stared, her eyes blinking rapidly. Then she turned away and gazed out the window. Look how blue the sky is, she said. I wish I could reach up and touch it. I bet it's soft. Mrs. Green was practically on top of us. Would you like to go for a walk? It's beautiful today, I said. Mrs. Green's eyes widened and I looked up at her. Can I take her for a walk? Well, does she want to go out? Would you like to go out, Grandma? Yes, she said firmly, not even noticing that I called her Grandma. I got up to help her, but when she didn't really need any assistance, she rose quickly, turned her head as if everyone were watching her move, and started out. Just stay in the garden and walk on the pathway, Mrs. Green said. There are attendants if you need any help. She seems fine, I said. You were right. She's being well taken care of, I added, but Mrs. Green didn't smile at the compliment. She watched us with the eyes of a hawk when we left the room. I took Grandma Belinda's arm onto mine and started out to the corridor that led to the garden. She was wearing a flowery scent that smelled refreshing. I like your perfume, I said. Do you? Nelson gave it to me. Nelson? He was here recently? Just the day before yesterday, or the day before that. He brings me a bottle of perfume whenever he comes, and we sit and talk about old times. Nelson is still quite a handsome man, don't you think? You mean Judge Childs? I asked. Yes, she said, laughing. Imagine, Nelson's a judge. When we stepped out, she paused to squint at the sunlight. Oh, it's warmer than I thought, she said. It should be my birthday, she added and laughed. I always say that on nice days. Olivia thinks it's very silly. What a silly thing to say. I wish it was my birthday. Like you could pick your birthday, she says. Your head's full of cranberries, she said. I had to laugh at Grandma Belinda's imitation of her sister. Shall we go to the garden? I asked. Oh yes, I love the smell of flowers. We walked silently for a while, then she paused and looked back to see if anyone was near us. You know why she says all those things and calls me all those names, don't you? Grandma Belinda asked in a deep whisper, snapping her head around to face me again. I shook my head. Because she knows Daddy loves me more. Daddy buys me nice clothes and Daddy takes me places. Daddy's proud to introduce me to his friends. Daddy wants her to stay in her room. She smiled coyly. Daddy told her to get married or else. She leaned toward me again. I put my ear to the door and I heard them yelling at her. Before, I felt more sorry for Samuel Logan than I did for her. He has to wake up every morning and see that grouchy face. I told him to sleep with his back to her so he could open his eyes and see the sunshine and not Olivia. She started to walk again. You know he was here, she said softly. He was here, you mean Samuel? She nodded, and then she stopped suddenly. But don't you tell, promise? I promise. When was he here? Last night. He came to my window and knocked, and I opened it and said, Samuel, Logan, what are you doing at my window in the night before your wedding? Wedding? I shook my head. If you don't let me in, he said, I'll kill myself. Last night? Shh, she said, looking around. She continued to walk, moving a little faster. The attendant followed us. People here tell Olivia things. She has spies everywhere. Let's sit on this bench, she said. It was under a spreading maple tree with a row of multicolored impatiens behind it. I sat next to her. She leaned back and waited for the attendant to walk by us slowly. Whispering again, Grandma Belinda continued, I said you won't kill yourself. And he said, I will. I swear. So I let him in. Let him in? He crawled through the window and fell to the floor. It was quite a sight. Shh, I told him. Someone will hear you, and how will that look? You're here the night before you're going to marry my sister. He laid there on the floor, and I sat on the floor, and he told me how sad he was and how terrible it was. He wanted me to make him feel better, so I did. If Olivia knew, she would have put poison in my food. She wouldn't do that, Grandma. Oh, yes, she would. She poisoned my songbird. I know she did, even though she says she didn't. Daddy bought it for me on my 16th birthday, and she was jealous. Nelson bought me something nice, too, she added, and that made her more jealous. He bought me a gold locket with a red ruby in the center. It had his picture inside. She smiled and then grimaced. Do you know where that locket is? No, where is it? Ask Olivia. She took it and buried it somewhere. I'm sure. One day it wasn't in my jewelry cabinet. That was that. You can kill my birds, you can steal my jewelry, but you can't keep them from liking me more, I told her. She said that she didn't care, and they were all ugly filanders. But that's like a story about the fox and the grapes, right? The fox and the grapes? The fox couldn't reach the grapes, so he said they were sour. Yep, sour grapes. That's Olivia, all right. She laughed and then took a deep breath. Look at that bluebird, she said, pointing. It's beautiful. Yes, I wouldn't mind being turned into a bird. When people get old, they should be turned into birds, she concluded. I read a story like that once. She turned back to me. Are you going to read another story, she asked. If you want me to, I will when we're back inside. Of course I want you to. I want to hear happy endings, only happy endings. More happy endings, she chanted. She wanted to walk some more, and then she decided it was time to go back. When we stepped back into the building, she said she was tired, already forgetting that she'd asked me to read another story. I'm not as young as I was. I get tired so fast now. Thanks, she told me. I was just someone else who worked there. Grandma, I said, pressing my hand into hers, I'm your daughter Haley's daughter, Melanie. I'm your granddaughter. I'm going to come back and visit you often. Would you like that? Haley, she said. She shook her head slightly. I know someone named Haley. Nelson told me about her. She's very pretty, isn't she? Yes, I said. There was no point in telling her all that happened. She had taken in too much already, I thought. She was physically strong for her age, but mentally, she was very fragile as a little girl, and I knew from personal experience how easy it was to shatter a little girl's heart. She should go for a nap before lunch, Mrs. Green said, suddenly appearing in the corridor. Yes, I was taking her to her room. I'll see that she gets there, she said, and nodded to the attendant, who had been outside hovering over us. He moved quickly to Grandma Belinda's side. I'll see you soon, Grandma. Have a great nap and a good lunch. I kissed her cheek and touched it, as if I planted something very precious on her face. You look like someone I know, she said, and then she smiled. I remember. You look like me when I was your age. She leaned closer to whisper, Don't give your heart away too quickly. They like to break hearts. That's what they like to do the most. Just ask Olivia, she said and laughed. Ask her to tell you that I told you to ask. What? She looked at the attendant as if she heard him say something. There was some mild chastisement in his expression, and she straightened up. Oh. I stood watching them as the attendant led her down the hall. I'll show you the way out, Mrs. Green said. I remember the way, I told her. Thank you. I hurried down the corridor, through the lobby and out the door, my heart thumping. Raymond sat up quickly the moment I appeared, and he got out to open the door for me. Everything go all right, he asked. Yes, I said, just fine. I sat back and looked within my own thoughts. As we were driving, I realized that he was taking me to Grandma Olivia's house. Why are you taking me here? I demanded. It's what Mrs. Logan told me to do, he said, and drove up the driveway. What am I supposed to do now? I asked. He shrugged. I guess Mrs. Logan expects you. Be nice if she told me her plans for me, I snapped and got out. She came to the door herself when I rang. Raymond said, You told him to bring me here directly after my visit, I said. Yes, come in the living room. Sit, she offered, as if I were Ulysses the dog. Why did you tell him to bring me here? I'm not accustomed to people standing over me when we talk, she replied, and sat back, waiting for me to obey her and sit on the settee. I did so quickly. Well, I demanded. I thought it was best for you to speak to me about your visit before you spoke to anyone else. Tell me how it went and don't leave out any details. I'm surprised you don't know everything already, I said. What's that supposed to mean? The way they were hovering around us listening. Ridiculous. Maybe it was, I thought, but it's easy to become paranoid where this family is concerned. I took a deep breath and wondered what I should tell her. I didn't want Grandma Belinda to appear foolish just because she loved children's books and confused about times and places now. And I remembered Grandpa Samuel telling me to come to him with any stories first. She's very sweet. I thought she looked very healthy. She's only a year or so younger than you, I asked deliberately. Grandma Olivia stiffened. Never mind that. What nonsense did she tell you? I'm sure she rambled on and on about something silly. I shrugged. She told me about her youth and how many boyfriends she had. One of them being the judge. Grandma's Olivia's eyes narrowed into hateful slits. He wasn't her boyfriend when she was younger. That's just one of her fantasies. That's exactly the sort of nonsense I'm talking about, she said, her words biting and sharp. I suddenly saw how vulnerable and helpless Grandma Belinda must have been growing up with Olivia. She said that you were jealous of her and that you poisoned her songbird and stole her locket that the judge gave her. Oh? She shook her head and smiled as though I had uttered the most ridiculous thing. She tells that story to everyone. That bird died of natural causes, and I don't know why she carries on and on about it. When it was alive, I was the one who had to take care of it. She never fed it or cleaned its cage. And as for the locket, it was a present I received from someone that she fantasized it was for her. Men never bought her things. They didn't have to, she added dryly. All they had to do was turn a flirtatious face in her direction, and she was theirs. What else did she say? She said your marriage was forced on you, I blurted, unable to hide my anger in the way that she criticized my real grandmother at every turn. Is that why she brought me here? Did she get some sadistic pleasure from it? It wasn't forced on me, but my parents had a great deal more to say about who their children married back then. It was better that wiser minds prevail. Far fewer of those marriages ended in divorce, and if she had listened to my father, she wouldn't be in the predicament today. She said that you forbade her to mention my mother. Is that true? That, Grandma Olivia said, is the first true thing she told you. Yes, of course I forbade her to mention Haley. What sort of situation would that have been about her babbling this embarrassing event? You think I wanted the gossip mongers clicking their tongues? It was bad enough that some of the servants knew and the doctor knew, but somehow I managed to keep everyone from suffering. You sit here now with your eyes full of condemnation and accusation, but do you pause to think what I provided for your mother? No, you don't, she said, answering herself quickly. Well, I'll tell you. Your mother was a child born out of wedlock. Normally a disgrace, but I gave her a home and my name and the best of everything. She could have had a fine education, met the most distinguished men, and had a real future, but she was contaminated by Belinda's bad blood. And now you think I am too, is that it? That remains to be seen, she snapped. Not by you. I'm not auditioning for your approval, I fired back at her, the tears burning under my eyelids. Tears I would die before releasing in her presence. Nevertheless, she said, her smile sharp and her eyes bright and fiery, you'll do nothing to risk my disapproval, or you'll see to it I never get my inheritance? I know, I said. That's right, she replied and sat back. There was a moment of silence, a truce between us. I wouldn't recommend that you return to the home to see Belinda, she said slowly. She'll only fill you up with ridiculous fantasies, and it might cause problems for everyone. She needs visitors, family. You can't leave her like that all alone and lost. Grandma Olivia laughed. She's far from alone and far from lost. She has the best care money can buy. If anything, she's spoiled, and she's been spoiled all her life. That's why she ended up like she did, she concluded. Don't go back there, she said, standing. I will. She's my real grandmother, I said. Grandma Olivia's eyes lifted as they could burn through my skull and sear my brain. She's a mental invalid, totally dependent on my charity. I could have had her put in a country poorhouse in minutes, she threatened. What do you expect she can give you? Love, I said, not backing down or looking away. Grandma Olivia sucked in her breath as if I had punched her in the stomach. She started to speak but then stopped, her eyes strangely softening, her look turning from anger and condemnation to unexplainable look of pleasure and respect. Don't push me too far, Melanie. I would like to see you have a good life, despite what you think of me, but you have to rise above yourself and your own contaminated blood. Am I dismissed? I asked. I was trembling inside, but I wouldn't show it. Dismissed? Yes, but keep my advice hanging up in front of your closet, she said. Raymond will see you get home. Thank you, I said. I turned and marched out of the house, never welcoming the fresh sea air as much.